My name is Pam Clark-Reidenbach with the Northern Illinois Center for Nonprofit Excellence at NIU. Our center, NICNI, was provided a Healing Illinois grant to assist in building a culture of belonging in Rockford. We have been and will continue to walk with Professor Powell to build a community where everyone is seen, heard, and valued, and where systems are co-created so all people prosper and thrive. We are grateful to the United Way of Northwest Illinois for partnering on this grant, and grateful to the Regional Office of Education for this opportunity to take a deep dive into targeted universalism with educators. We'll have an hour presentation by Professor Powell, and then an open Q&A discussion on how you might implement TU at your school or your facility for better educational outcomes. We ask you to keep your screens on mute, put any questions in the chat box until we have the discussion. The discussion will be facilitated by Chris Collins, Director of Networks and Partnerships with the Regional Office of Education, and Tamara Butler, Assistant Principal at Lincoln Middle School. So Tara, I turn the Zoom over to you to introduce Professor Powell.
Good afternoon, everyone. As she said, my name is Tamara Butler, and I'm Assistant Principal at Lincoln Middle School here in Rockford, Illinois. John Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. John is the Director of Othering and Belongings Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, a research institute that brings together scholars, community advocates, communicators, and policymakers to identify and eliminate the barriers to an inclusive, just, and sustainable society, and to create transformative change towards a more equitable world. John holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor Chair in Equity and Inclusion and is a professor of law, African American Studies, and Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. Previously, he was the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University, where he also held the Gregory H. Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Moritz College of Law. He is the author of several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. John led the development of an opportunity-based model that connects affordable housing to education, health, healthcare, and employment, and is well known for his work developing the frameworks of targeted universalism and other and belonging to effect equity-based interventions. We welcome John A. Powell.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you. It's a lot going on. So I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to try to pull it up, and it's a little long, so we may not get through it all. It's a lot of material to cover in a couple hours. And even though your questions can be, we'll get to that in the second half. If there's something that's burning, just don't sit on it for an hour. So feel free to stop me if you need to. Let's see. I'm trying to do the share the screen. Okay, let's see. I think this is it. Okay, can you see that?
We can see that.
Great. So I don't know how much, I know some of you know a fair amount about targeted universalism, and some of you may not. So again, if I'm going too fast, or if there's something you don't understand, or if you say, we actually know all that, so we can just go to the heart of the matter, please make it interactive. So I'm going to try to cover the concept, and then toward the end, give some practical examples of what's been done and what can be done. And then we can have a discussion and figure out the best way to follow up. So this is a short video.
If you're an accredited investor, I have big news. In the last 12 months, I bought 5 major.
Of all the forces shaping politics and power around the world, perhaps none are more important than our sense of who we are and who we are becoming.
Dr. Powell?
We are in a period of accelerated change in at least
Can't
4
see the
areas.
video. You may need to do a new share with the YouTube window.
Technology, the environment. Hold on. May need to do what?
Do a new share with the YouTube window.
Okay. Let me see.
If you need any assistance, let me know.
I need a lot of assistance.
That's why we're here together.
Okay. So how do I, well, let me try this one thing.
Sure. Let's see, when you click share screen on the bottom again, you can select your browser or whatever window you have that video in and click share. Make sure you click share sound on the bottom left.
I'm trying to get back to Zoom. Let's see.
You might have to hit escape if your video is full screen.
Yeah. Okay. Let me do this. Okay, so I see, let's see, new share.
Mhm.
Okay, that.
There's a little checkbox on the bottom left of that new share window that says share sound. Make sure you click that. The very bottom corner of that pop-up.
It says new share.
Mhm.
And then what else am I looking for?
If you're in new share, you should be okay to click
Okay.
your browser or your video window and go ahead and
Um, I'm getting a window. I don't see the browser. Let's see.
If I stop your screen sharing, will that help?
Okay. All right.
There you go.
And
Maybe
now,
try share screen one more time.
okay. Okay. And then it has basic, advanced, and files.
You should be able to just choose it from the basic.
Okay.
You should see your browser or your video screen as an option.
I don't see that as an option. Share sound.
If you can't
then-
access it for some reason, I can always share the link in the chat for folks to pull up later.
Okay.
Or if you put the link in the chat, then I can share my screen and I can put it out that way.
That sounds good. And we go back to.
Yeah, because you've got a presentation going. Sometimes it'll only do the presentation screen.
Sorry for that.
And Dr. Powell, we've been on Zoom for over a year and we all deal with this all the time. So there's a lot of grace here.
I know.
A lot of grace in this room because we're all dealt with this.
I'll tell you, this pandemic is something, but I'm so sick of
My mission in life is to
Please.
spread positivity.
You have to
of all the forces
pause
shaping
that.
politics and power around the world. Perhaps none. And I'll copy it into the chat.
Perfect.
Yep. Copy the chat and send it, and I'll go ahead and copy it and I'll start it and I'll share my screen.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
And then. Okay.
All right, I'll get you. Just give me a quick second.
Are you guys getting spring weather now in Rockford?
Finally.
Grammarly helps you work more efficiently, which makes
All right.
accomplishing your work goals easier than ever before.
Okay. I'm almost there. Let's see. Okay. Can you see the YouTube?
Yep, I can see it.
Awesome.
Get full sentence rewrite.
Of all the forces shaping politics and power around the world, perhaps none are more important than our sense of who we are and who we are becoming. We are in a period of accelerated change in at least 4 areas: globalization, technology, the environment, and demographic change. We can only process so much change in a short period of time without experiencing anxiety, which is a normal biological reaction. But how we respond to this anxiety is social. Our response is greatly shaped by the stories presented by leadership and through culture. These stories speak to our deepest values and our core beliefs about who we are, many of which operate at the subconscious level. We can respond to these changes either as a threat or as an opportunity. The first response is breaking. The second is bridging. Breaking can create a deep fear of other groups, making it easier to accept false stories of us versus them. Breaking perpetuates isolation, hardens racism, and builds oppressive systems, while driving our politics and institutions toward anti-democratic and inhumane practices. The other response is bridging, which calls on us to imagine a larger, more inclusive we. When we bridge, we see demographic change and our diverse identities as positive and enhancing who we are. Bridging calls on us to engage in healthy dialogue and requires us to listen deeply. Bridging does not mean abandoning your identity. Bridging means acknowledging our shared humanity, rejecting that there is a them, and moving toward a future where there is instead a new us. But when we bridge, we not only open up to others, we also open up to changes within ourselves, where we can participate in creating a society built on belonging.
Enjoy these 15 odd.
Okay. Now, so now we're opening back up the slide deck.
It's all you now. You got the show.
All right. Don't go anywhere though.
No, I'm right here.
So while that was playing, my assistant sent me an updated deck. So I'm trying to download that. I looked at it this morning, asked him to make some changes. So that should just take 1 second. So the heart of that slide, which we just looked at, is to really show how what's driving a lot of the anxiety that we're dealing with right now. And as the video suggested, that the rapid change actually creates a sense of anxiety. What we do with that anxiety is social. Now let me just see, sort of bouncing back and forth. Can you see my screen now?
You have to restart. You have to reshare.
Okay. Um,
There you go, Dr. Powell. It's all up and going.
okay. Let me just go to. All right. So again, this really just showed you that these dynamics that are producing polarization in our society and really around the world, they're not going to go away. We're living with them for some time, foreseeable time, and what we can do is sort of understand them and begin to try to make some interventions to address them. And as those of you who've heard me before, I think the most powerful thing is to move toward a sense of belonging. And belonging is a deeper dive than inclusion. Belonging means people co-create together as opposed to you joining something that someone else has created. It also requires agency, care, and responsibility. And so you actually are creating the thing you belong to. And actually, this is actually quite important in terms of education, in terms of do the students, parents, and teachers and administrators all feel like they're participating in co-creating the education system. And to the extent that they don't, it creates problems. And one of the ways you do that is through bridging. Bridging actually helps in terms of connecting with people who are, you may think of as different than you or may not see the world the same way. Some of you may have followed this. There's actually been some recent challenges by some commentators basically saying we shouldn't be talking about equity, that we really should be going back to equality, and equity is problematic and racist. And I'm not exactly sure what they mean by equity, but let me tell you how I see the evolution of equity and why equity is really important, but really also a precursor to belonging. And for those of you who heard me say this before, just bear with me for a minute. So our concept of equality really comes from Aristotle. And Aristotle had two versions of equality. He talked about arithmetic equality, where you treat people who are situated the same. So fairness and equality requires, under Aristotle's definition, that you treat people who are situated the same. But he also said, equality and fairness requires that you treat people who are situated different. And so that takes us away from sort of a formalistic notion of equality. You don't treat a person who is sighted and a person who is blind the same in terms of reading a book. They're situated differently, they need different interventions. And in this little slide here, you see if the goal is to have people look over the fence, people are situated differently. So some people need a little stool, some people need a bigger stool, and then one person standing on a mound. And so it's recognizing that, again, fairness and equality, in this case equity, would require different interventions for different groups who are situated differently in relationship to structures and culture. And then belonging takes us one step further, which is people get to co-create in that design of the thing that they're participating in. So it's not people just existing in structures and institutions, it's actually people owning those institutions or being part of it. So targeted universalism is basically saying that we have universal goals, but we have targeted strategies. And the goal of targeted universalism is not, and this should be corrected, is not simply eliminating disparities. It's actually trying to get people to a universal goal. So what that might mean is that, let's say in the education context, you have 80% of the students reading at proficiency by the time they graduate. Well, if you just focus on disparities, you might break that down and say, well, middle-class white children are reading at 85%, Black children are reading at 60%, Latinos are reading at 50%. So how do we eliminate that disparity? Well, first of all, there are a lot of ways to eliminate that disparity. One, you could reduce the performance of white children, and or you could increase the performance of Black and Latino children. But let's say you arrived at every group will be reading a proficiency of 70%. The disparity is gone. So targeted universalism would say that's not good enough. You actually want to set a goal that's independent of what anyone actually is achieving. So you might say, we want 95 or 100% proficiency, and no group is actually performing at that level. Now, it's interesting, if you can achieve that, you've also eliminated the disparity. If every group's at 95%, there's no disparity, but the goal was above what any group was achieving before you set the universal. So you set the universal independent of what any group has. And then your strategy for getting groups to that universal will differ because groups are situated differently. So sometimes we think of universal strategies. We're going to do the same thing for everybody. Well, universal strategies is not what we're after. We have to universal goals and targeted strategies to get them there. So that's the heart of targeted universalism. In many ways, the hard work around targeted universalism is figuring out two things. First of all, figuring out what the universal is, but secondly, it also requires recognizing how people are situated differently. So that means data. That also means understanding the implications of that. So the disparities themselves may give you some data, but it doesn't give you the deep data you need in terms of understanding how people are situated in relationship to structures. If you don't do that, if you just say, let's close out the disparities, what we have found, and there's an article which I'll send to you later, basically, you put people in competition for what they perceive as scarce resources. So if you just take an approach of closing the disparities, and the disparities are based on what one group has and what other group do not have, you create a sense of scarcity and a possible redistribution. So that, instead of creating bridging, which we talked about a little bit, it creates breaking. It creates a deeper sense of us versus them, which actually is very unproductive and very destructive. And so you want to try to avoid breaking wherever you can. And you do that in part by saying, we're actually trying to achieve something where everyone benefits. And there is not a winner and a loser. You also want to focus on structures. So you're looking at two things. You're looking at groups and you're looking at structures. So the structure is not working the same for different groups, and so you need some intervention at the structural level. So in this case, you're trying to see what's on the other side of the fence. And this young man is blind. So if he's trying to experience what's on the other side of the fence, even removing the fence won't help him. He needs a very different intervention than the other students. And it's not because he's special, and it's not a special model for him. It's just he needs something different than other groups. So a lot of the issues around structural racism is actually also understanding the role of opportunity. And opportunity is structured if you will. And there's a analogy of trying to understand why the bird doesn't fly away. You can't understand it by looking at one dimension. You have to look at the interaction of all the different wires in the cage together. And so when you're looking at students, it's a mistake to just look at one dimension. But it's important to understand how these different dimensions interact and produce certain outcomes. So in that sense, again, targeted universalism is built up on a notion of a structural or systems approach, and you're looking at these structures and systems in terms of how people are situated. And one of the things that we often miss is that structures are doing work, which means they're not neutral. So this is an airplane back in the good old days when we used to fly. And if you think about luggage racks overhead, again, the structure is there to do some work. What is the work doing in this case is to store our luggage. Well, people who are shorter are disadvantaged by this structure. And what group is shorter? Well, statistically, women as a group are shorter. Statistically, women as a group have less upper body strength. And this is a little controversial, but I think it's true nonetheless. We'll assume it's true. As a group, women carry more luggage. So this luggage racks is actually disadvantaging women. And it's not that someone thought of that when they designed the luggage rack. It's not like, let's raise it so women can't reach it. Structures do work, whether we intend for it to do the work or not. So one of the things we encourage people to do is to think about opportunity structures. And we've actually mapped out the structure of opportunities for regions all over the country. Raj Chetty has done this on a national level. We've done it at state, local level. And what constitute those opportunity structures can be decided by people. But good housing, good schools, roads without potholes in them, grocery stores, safe neighborhoods, parks, clean water. So many of those things, many of those structures that we actually think about as creating opportunity, we don't think about them until they're not there. So we don't think about we need clean water until the water is easy to turn off or it's not clean. Then it's paramount in terms of we got to get water back on the table. So structures oftentimes are doing work, but they do work oftentimes in the background. We don't think about them until they're not there, which also means that we don't see how they affect different groups differently. So people of color and low-income people are more likely to live in areas where there's low opportunity. And we've done, like I said, now decades of opportunity mapping, where you just physically, and you can do it at other scales as well, map out the distribution of opportunity in the community, and then we overlay it with populations so you can see where people are in relationship to opportunity. And it's oftentimes, more often than not, it's race and race sensitive, in the sense that Black people are more likely to live in low opportunity areas. So opportunity is racialized and it's spatial, and it even happens on a global level. And this oftentimes surprises us. When you think about the pandemic, we did a lot of work on this. People were actually surprised that the pandemic was so unevenly affecting populations. The first thought was that the pandemic would affect everyone the same. Governor Cuomo made that statement that it was the great equalizer. But even as he was making that statement, some of us was very suspicious that would not be the case. No one believes that now. And it's not because obviously anyone planned for that, but the pandemic or any event moves through the existing structures. And so if structures are uneven, things moving through those structures are going to amplify that unevenness. So again, part of it is to think about the structures and who they serve and who they don't serve, or they don't serve as well. So here's a man trying to get from one floor to the next, which is what we use escalators for, but it simply doesn't serve him. Now you could say he's the problem, get him some crutches and try to get him on the escalator, but it's going to be awkward. Or you could say the structure itself is actually doing work that's making it hard for him to get from one floor to the other and easy for other people. And these structures are all over. I mean, once we start looking for them, they're everywhere. And so part of the thing is to understand how race and other issues are actually structured into our society. Notice I haven't talked about any people having negative attitudes or being racist. I'm talking about how, it's not that those things don't happen, they do, but most of the work, there's a consensus that most of the work is done at the structural level. So again, we actually advocate that people think about creating a process and a structure of belonging as opposed to inclusion. And the major difference between those two is that in inclusion, you're joining something that's already there. So you're relatively passive. And if there's any adjustment to be made, you as the joiner are called upon to make all the adjustments. Belonging actually says you get to co-create the thing you belong to. And yet now, when you co-create, you're not just co-creating for yourself, you're co-creating for everyone, and you're co-creating for the institution itself. Again, difference between, I sometimes think of Targeted Universalism as equity 2.0, right? So we're trying to actually, equity is the way it's practiced in the United States. It's largely around closing disparities, and that gets translated into competition for scarcity. This is a video on Targeted Universalism, and I'm conflicted as to whether or not I should try to show it. I'll turn to you and just.
If you have a link you want to drop in the chat, I'm sure Chris would pull that up for you.
Okay, maybe I'll grab the link and try that again.
Yeah, maybe copy it from that link.
Okay.
Can actually see your video this time, so you might be able to play it right from there. Yeah.
Okay, great.
What is the most effective and sustainable policy response to problems in our society? Universal approaches are widely used in order to package policies for broad appeal. Universal policies such as Social Security and minimum wage laws provide the same benefits or minimum protections to everyone, regardless of status or group membership. But by treating everyone the same, universal approaches can't root out group-based discrimination and may actually deepen inequality between groups rather than reduce it. And by providing benefits or protections to everyone, resources that could be targeted to groups worse off instead flow to those who are better off. In contrast to universalism, targeted approaches are commonly used. Targeted policies provide benefits or protections based on group membership or status. SNAP, the food stamp program, conditions benefits on income level. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires public accessibility for disabled groups, and affirmative action focuses on historically disadvantaged groups. Targeted approaches are vulnerable to the critique that they unfairly favor constituent groups over the public good by directing resources to marginalized groups who are already subjected to unfair stereotypes. But universal and targeted approaches are false choices. There is a third way: targeted universalism. Targeted universalism means setting universal goals that can be achieved through targeted approaches. This approach targets the varying needs of each group while reminding us that we are all part of the same social fabric. This can be accomplished by following these 5 steps. First, set a universal goal. For example, 100% proficiency in 8th grade math. Second, measure how the overall population fares relative to the universal goal. In this example, we might discover that only 80% of 8th graders are proficient in 8th grade math. Third, measure the performance of population segments relative to the universal goal. So although 80% of all 8th graders are proficient, we might find that only 70% of Latinos are proficient. Fourth, understand how structures and other factors support or impede groups' progress toward the universal goal. For our Latino students, classroom instruction materials and lessons designed for English speakers may impede learning, including math proficiency. Finally, implement targeted strategies so that each group can achieve the universal goal based upon their needs and circumstances. This may take the form of ESL-specific math tutoring for our Latino students, while another group may require a completely different strategy to achieve the same universal goal. Targeted universalism rejects a blanket universal, which may be indifferent to the reality that different groups are situated differently relative to the institutions and resources of society. By aspiring towards shared universal goals, targeted universalism empowers targeted strategies capable of achieving those goals while moving us beyond concerns over disparities alone and toward our highest aspirations for all.
Okay, let me get back to. Okay, I doesn't want to do that. Okay. All right. So part of it, again, is just to recap, is that you want to figure out what the universal is, and then develop appropriate approaches to get there for each group. This is just recapping what we just discussed. One of the things that sometimes is confusing to people, they will assume that target universalism means that you actually focus exclusively on the most marginal group. And so you see on the left, you're getting the person who's on the ground floor all the way to the top. But instead, target universalism is getting everyone to the top. If you just do the intervention on the left, you actually create tensions between groups because some groups who may be slightly better off, but still not to the top, feel like they're being ignored. So part of the thing that your school would need to do is develop those universal goals. Now, as I suggested earlier, co-creating, belonging means co-creating. So in developing those goals, it's important that there's a large group of people the community, the teachers, the administration who participate in that process where they can co-create the goals. So the goals aren't decided by fiat or by just the superintendent. What we know is that even where we have high opportunity areas, there's sometimes still disparities. The disparities matter. They tell us something's not working, they're not working for a particular group, but it doesn't tell us what it is. Again, the work around opportunity mapping helps a lot because we find that when people live in low opportunity areas, everyone live in those areas, it tends to depress their performance across a whole number of areas. Unfortunately, what we do is we structure opportunities so that the groups who are most marginal oftentimes live in low opportunity areas. So one of the things we advocate for is that you, for example, in terms of housing, you build low-income housing in places where there's high-performing schools. And that we structure opportunity so that everyone can actually have access to opportunities. But even having done that, it still will not necessarily address all of the disparities. And so we have to continue to look further to figure out what's going on that's actually creating those disparities. So the physical neighborhood is one of those structures, but it's not the only structure. There are others as well. So these are a couple of examples. There was an effort to get everyone to swim, and this I think was in Seattle. And the question was, how do you do that? First of all, you need the data to find out who's not swimming. And then they found out some interesting things. There were some populations who, for religious or moral reasons, could not have co-ed swimming. And so they had to think about that. There was also problems in terms of some people didn't have access to pools. So they had to factor that in. And they eventually came with a program that was proficient in really looking at all the different groups, but it was targeted. So it wasn't one program with the same intervention. It had to be multiple interventions to get everyone to that goal of swimming. And when you looked at it, you found out that it wasn't evenly distributed. So people who are not swimming, for example, and people, in fact, people who are drowning, more likely to be young people of color. And you see it down on the bottom here, Blacks drown in swimming pools 10 times the rate of whites. But the goal, again, is not just to get them, Blacks, to the same place as whites, but to actually stop the drowning and get everyone to be able to swim. And this is just going through some of the details of how it's done. And if there's interest, like, we could make some of this more available. But this is a project that worked very well. And again, you see that people had different needs. Sometimes there were scholarships. Sometimes there had to be single gender swim classes. Which may sound like a simple thing, but it had to be go through a number of legal requirements, whether this was gender discrimination. This is a picture of a young woman who was going to school at University of Texas at Austin, and the Black and Latino students were not graduating, and Texas literally spent millions of dollars to try to fix this problem. Huge disparity between them and the white students. And they assumed it was because they had not been trained properly in undergraduate school. And it turns out that the majority of the problem was that they had a sense of not belonging. And since then, there's been a whole industry sort of dealing with how students feel. This is in some ways building on Claude Steele's work around stereotype threat. But if students don't feel like they belong, their performance goes down across the board. For a whole host of reasons, Black and Latino students oftentimes feel like they don't belong. Not the least of which sometimes is the curriculum itself. I visited UT Austin. They were trying to recruit me to come teach there. And as they were showing me around the campus, they commented that I should not be uncomfortable because they had a significant amount of Confederate memorabilia, reminding me that they fought on the side of the South in the Civil War. Well, I studied this stuff and know that that even no matter what I thought consciously, that this would have an impact on my sense of belonging in that place. I did like the school. I ended up not going there, but there was no incidence of someone saying something to these students that was untoward in terms of races or whatever. But the general environment created a sense of a deep alienation and not belonging. Once they start correcting for that, the students' performance shot up so fast that some people thought they had to be cheating. So one of the things we encourage schools to do is to really both do surveys so they have a sense of how students feel. It may or may not be appropriate at elementary school, but certainly in graduate school or even high school. But then how do you actually create a space where students feel like they belong? And there are things you can do to do that. And when there's a stereotype at play, it has a negative effect for a bunch of reasons. The students who are the target of that stereotype, they're aware of it, and the students who are not. And there are a number of things you can do to overcome that. What we talked about just a minute ago is to talk about the environment, and it's mainly environmental, but also critical mass. So if you're the only woman in a math class, that stereotype is like the stereotype that women are not good at math are likely to be very present. To give you an example, there was a study finding that in terms of Black students' interest in taking advanced placement classes, if an upper class student who's, if you increase the number of upper class students taking those classes by 1%, the number of lower class students who would be interested to take it will go up 20%. So students are reading the environment, they're looking at their peers to see if none of my peers belong in upper division courses and advanced placement. I have serious doubts that I do as well. So there are a number of mechanisms that can be put in place to actually address this. And again, all of this is predicated on structures and culture. None of this is predicated on explicit statements of not belonging. Here are some other schools that have actually engaged in different programs. Montclair, New Jersey, Duval County, Jackson, and Diversity Data Kits Project. All these have had some degree of success in terms of creating an environment where students feel like they belong, using at times some form of targeted universalism, and again, tracking the data. There's another program called Stop Holding Us Back. This is based in part on an article that was in the New York Times. And what they really found is that they really need to redesign schools. Again, once they focus on the needs of the students, met the students where they were, the graduation rate for Blacks and Latinos shot up. Also notice in this one, it wasn't just limited to the school. It also looked at what happened when you're out of school in terms of adults from the community, early warning systems, and the business community as well. So one of the things we're looking at now, and of course this is actually coming also from President Biden, is nationally universal pre-K. We know that a lot of students come to school in kindergarten already behind. And if they don't catch up by the second or third grade, the chances are that they will never catch up. So how do we actually identify those students and have interventions at a very early age? And in some ways, this is similar to Head Start. But one of the limitations of Head Start is that oftentimes the program actually had success, but it wasn't continued. And then a lot of that success actually went away. And this is just a map of different states that are doing work around pre-K. This is a situation in Baltimore. And it won't surprise many of you as educators, they found out that a substantial number of students, again, students of color in particular, were not doing well. And what they figured out is that a lot of them couldn't see. You're 7 years old, you've never been able to see well, you don't necessarily notice that you don't see as well as other students. So they eventually developed a program of testing all students and providing eyeglasses for all students if necessary. Obviously, some students didn't need this, but some students very much needed it. I'll just pause for a minute to say, when we see these disparities, so if you see students not doing well, how do we make meaning of that? It's not intuitive that you would say the students can't see. You might think, well, the students come from a bad home, they're not motivated. And of course, if a student can't see, it is true they're more likely to be disruptive. They're not engaging in the class in the same way other students, but not because they're naturally disruptive necessarily, but because they're disengaged because they can't really see. It's again the Baltimore program. And these are students who have different places on the spectrum. And what we know again is that the intervention for different kids on the spectrum, whether they're slightly autistic, or they actually need something quite different than students who don't. But one is identifying that, and two then is making the correct interventions. It's a program out of New York where they actually have a plan to actually identify those students and then keeping classes small and making the right interventions. So what are some of the things that you might do, Rockford, in terms of addressing your challenge using targeted universalism? And this is one school, the data we got. And a normal year, you have about 80% of the students on track. This year, it fell to 41%. And there's a substantial disparity. Only 30% of Black students are on track. And there's also a disparity between students, what students receive in terms of learning remotely. Some indications, and this is national as well as Rockford, that the gap or the students being derailed because of the pandemic is not evenly distributed across students, both racially and economically. So that means if you don't do anything, when you come back to classes in the fall, you're going to see all these disparities actually exacerbated. One other thing, or two other things before I open up for questions, and let me take a 2-minute drink break. But there's a lot of money coming down from the Biden administration to address some of these issues, and I don't know where what the process is or where Rockford is in terms of getting some of this money, but that's something to look at. There are also some school districts, like one example is the Wake County School District, that's actually had a great deal of success in terms of addressing a number of these issues at a systems level. And one example there, they don't allow any of their schools to have more than 40% of the students designated for free and reduced lunch. The data shows that once the number gets above a certain level, it has a negative effect on everyone, but especially Black and Latino students. And in implementing their plan, they found out that Black students' performance on standardized tests went up substantially, I think like 60%. For Latinos, it went up like 30%, and for whites, it went up 5%. Notice everybody's rising if you do it right. And these were largely structural interventions, and they were not without some controversy. So I'll stop there, come off of this, and go get a drink, and I'll be right back.
Hi, Dr. Powell. We had a question. One of the members of the group wanted to kind of have you discuss equality versus equity in a little bit more in depth. So if you can take an opportunity just to explain those two concepts and what the difference is, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great. I'll be right back. Okay, so I'll start with that question about the difference between equality and equity. And like a lot of things, there are literally books written on what is equality, but the simple way in which people thought about equality, especially in the West, and largely being influenced by Aristotle, is that you treat everybody the same, right? So, and that's sometimes referred to as formal equality. And the reason it's called formal equality is that you're not taking into consideration the different contexts that people are in. And that became, in many ways, the preferred way of thinking about equality for a lot of people in the 60s and 70s. It's like, just treat everybody the same. So it was, in a sense, it was grabbing onto Aristotle's first definition of equality, that is, people are situated the same, but it was assuming people were situated the same in every important way. Now, in terms of education, I'll give you an example of how extensive this was. A case out of San Francisco where immigrant students, I think they were Chinese immigrant students, they wanted instruction in Chinese. And the school said no. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court because, again, it's like, we're going to treat every learner the same. Well, if you're talking to me in Chinese, I'm not learning, and so now it seems almost silly to say you wouldn't teach students initially in their own language, right? Even if you're trying to eventually get them to English. So equity was a real attempt to take into consideration the second part of Aristotle's concept of equality, that we take a look at how people are situated, and that informs how we treat people. So if a person shows up in a wheelchair, you don't say we're going to treat that person the same as a person who shows up who's ambulatory. Equity would say, no, you have to look at the person's situation in relationship to the structures. As equity has developed as a concept in the United States, it shifted at some point, not necessarily in definition, but in practice, to focus almost exclusively on disparities. And so the focus became let's eliminate the disparities between the favored group and the less favored group. Oftentimes without any consideration as to, does the favored group have really what you want? Are they really where they should be? And in the context of race, this became, frankly, very tense, because it was like, let's actually get what white people have, which might mean taking something from white people to give it to people of color. And that went over like a lead balloon. And so then the fight became whether or not the whites had too much, whether or not people of color had too little, and who should pay for it. And that's why I say the fight over scarcity. Now, when you talk to people, they'll say, that's not what equity means. And I said, well, that may be true, but that's how it's practiced. Yes. And you know, full disclosure, I'm one of the people who sort of brought equity into the public discourse in the 80s and 90s. And when I saw that turn, initially I tried to pull it back. And after a while, it became, you can't pull it back. That's how that's what people are doing. You can't run around the country telling people they're misunderstanding it. And that's when I developed the concept of targeted universalism, which is say to state very clearly what the universal is. Now, some of my friends and colleagues in the academy would say, that's just equity. I say, that's fine. Call it equity 2.0. But the way most people practice equity is actually fighting over scarce resources. And that creates a much more vitriolic environment, especially in our country. And that's why I use targeted universalism.
Nice, nice. We're talking about targeted universalism and kind of developing some understanding, especially for educators in the room. How does targeted universalism relate to or compare to existing intervention models that already exist in districts, schools, and classrooms?
Well, a couple of things. There may be some similarities, but there are always going to be some differences. So part of it's also two things. Is one, how we understand things, and two, how we talk about them. So targeted universalism, by and large, not exclusively, is focusing on structures and groups, right? So it's not whether Ann is doing better than Joe or whether Billy is doing better than Fred. It's like you're looking at groups of people, which is also another complexity. Because, and this is, when we think about inequality, much of our understanding of it is that two people are not the same. So you're gonna have different outcomes, right? The understanding and justification for individual inequality is fundamentally different than the understanding and justification should be for group-based inequality, right? So you may say, I'm better at math than my sister, but it's very different to say men are better at math than women, right? I may be better at math than my sister because of any number of reasons, so she may be better at math than me. But when you see group-based inequality, the justification is not readily available. Then you start, so instead of looking at the people, like what's wrong with women? Why aren't they better at math? It's more like, what are the structures and culture that actually create an environment where women are not performing at math, right? So you don't focus on the individual, you focus on, and that's even more true with race, right? Because if we say, which a lot of people do, there's no real biological difference, a genetic difference between people of different race. So then why do we have these different outcomes, right? So if you think in terms of health, why are Black people dying at a higher rate than whites? Well, if you could say, well, it's genetic. Well, say no, most scientists would say, no, it's not genetic. So, okay, then what is it? Then you look at the structures and environment. So it's some complexity in there, but so part of it is to really have the data. And even more than that, targeted universalism is outcome oriented, right? So it's like, it's not just collecting the data. You're saying, look, we're trying to get 95, 100% of people to graduation. This group's at 30%. What do we do? As opposed to a long discussion about, well, Native Americans don't really care that much about education, and maybe they, so it's really outcome oriented rather than input and process oriented. And I'll just give you one example. I work with a number of school systems, but I went to one school system where students who were being put into disciplinary classes, expelled, expulsion, or whatever, were 4 or 5 times more likely to be Black students. And the Black parents at the school wanted to pull the kids out of the school, which would have destroyed the school system. The teachers felt like, what are you saying, we're racist? And so I helped them come up with a thing of, what are you trying to get to? You obviously want the schools to function, you want the students to function. But if you have, we came up with a formula, which was something like, if you have Blacks being disciplined at 1.5 times whites, then it's no longer the teacher's discretionary role to decide what to do. It goes up to the principal. If it goes up to two times the white students, it's no longer the principal's discretionary action. It goes up to the superintendent. Because what they were doing is that we're concerned about not just the disparities, but we're concerned that learners are being taken out of the classroom. And we need to look at this carefully and make every intervention we can to stop that from happening. And it worked. We created an incentive, and it was tricky because the teachers felt like, well, no, they're not supporting me. I got disruptive students, and but the parents felt like, I walk into the room where the students are disrupted. They're all Black. I'm not buying that. And it was a really interesting situation. I'm hesitating because I don't want to name the school. But we worked it through with them to sort of come up with something where everyone, talking about co-create, everyone had a dog in the fight. Everyone had a stake. We're not calling teachers racist. We're not saying the kids are just whatever. And this is the goal that we all want. How do we get there?
Excellent. I'm going to have you expand upon co-creation. The term has been used a couple times in your presentation. Can you kind of give your working definition of co-create?
Yeah, basically it's that everyone has an effective voice in design and implementation and evaluation. So it's our thing, right? And so it's our thing because we designed it. We may have different lanes. So certain people will have, I may not be in the classroom, but I meet with teachers, I meet with the school, and we sort of talk about what we are collectively, not what the school is trying to achieve, not just what the parents are trying to achieve, not even what just the children, the learners are trying to achieve. What do we agree? And it doesn't mean unanimity. It doesn't mean that there won't be one person who says, no, I'm not trying to achieve that, but it's a collective process. And that collective process starts at the very beginning. And so you get buy-in. In some ways, it's just a radical expression of democracy, that we make the laws we live by. That's what democracy really, really means. And in any situation, whether it's a job or schools or whatever, you're more likely to be invested if you had a hand in saying what it is, what the rules are. So that's the idea of co-creation, is that everyone has, and in order to co-create, we say you have to have responsibility, you have to have agency, you have to have power, and you have to care. Sometimes we ask people to co-create and they don't have the capacity. We work with, examples, let's say we're trying to create a curriculum for students. Well, I'm not a curriculum designer. I don't know how to create a curriculum. I may have ideas. And so we also say you have to make sure that everyone have capacity to actually be at the table in a meaningful way.
Thank you. I got a couple of questions from people that are sitting in the audience. And the first question is about how do we engage targeted universalism to get affirmative action legislation back across the finish line, state by state?
It's a great question. So we just had that issue here in California, and it may or may not surprise people, but my institute, we didn't robustly engage it because we felt like it was framed as a zero-sum game. And we think that that's actually quite toxic. And so in this case, it was like, effectively it was an attack on Asians, on whites as well, but certainly Asians. It's like, and what people may not know, I teach at UC Berkeley. the plurality of students at UC Berkeley are Asian, not white. The largest number of students are Asians, and we didn't have a good way of making meaning of that, And so implicit in that, we're attacking Asians. I said, no, we're not. I'm not. This is before the violence directed at Asians. So first of all, if you really focus on structures, you situate people within structures. So I've been involved in the issues around affirmative action for 30 years. What I suggested, actually, I did the program for Brazil and to some extent South Africa. Brazil adopted most of what I suggested. But anyway, the point is that if you say we're actually going to give affirmative action to Blacks because of the history of discrimination, what conservatives would always say is, what about the white Appalachian? Mm-hmm. And people would say, no, they're not in, they're not Black, right? I would say yes. I would say, what are the conditions? What are the structures? What are the cultures that actually truncate people's opportunity and the system doesn't work for them? And Robert Sampson at Harvard, he agrees with me on this. He says, look at 4 or 5 conditions. So if you said intergenerational poverty, living in concentrated poverty, that is not just you're poor, but your community is poor. No one from your high school, no one graduated from college. You have very little wealth. I mean, you can pick the data you want, but you say people who actually have all these things combined are very unlikely to perform in school. We can actually figure that out. And I say, Robert Sampson has done that. And he said, in the 6 indicators he looked at, looking at urban areas, 93% of the people who live at those intersections are African American. But it means 7% are not. I would include the 7%. Because we're saying we're trying to disrupt these structures and cultures that actually truncate people's lives. And if you can show me a life that's being truncated, a group that's being truncated by these same structures, and what that does, what that would do is it actually takes away one of the biggest arguments against affirmative action. And it's actually right, that you do want everyone to get to that universal, every group. And so, there's subtle ways in which people may be disadvantaged. People would say to me, yeah, but if the person from Appalachia went to New York, they could hail a cab and you couldn't. And I say, no, they can't hail a cab because they don't have cab fare. They may be white. Chris, I don't know if you look, I worked in the Ohio State University, so I worked in the Appalachian community. I know it fairly well. At one point, the life expectancy for a man was under 50. Working in the coal mine, you could go all day in many parts of Appalachia and you wouldn't see anyone with a full set of teeth. The conditions were terrible, right? And for someone to say, we're gonna include them, I'd say, yeah, do it. But I couldn't convince my colleagues of that. So that's a battle, at least for now, I lost.
It's an interesting conversation, absolutely. So when you're talking about targeted universalism, I think in education, we can relate it a lot to what we call response to intervention, at least on the academic side. It's providing kids what they need in order to be successful. So when you're looking at targeted universalism within a community, what is the determination of what is success? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's part of the co-creation, right? Even in terms of evaluation. So what is the universal? I've worked with Casey Foundation, for example, and they've taken the practice of targeted universalism, and they do a lot of work in education. They said, so we have these universal, and we're going to now make sure to try to organize the schools to get there. And I, as a consultant, say, and how did you come up with these universals? Yes. And they say, well, we just came up with them. So then it's not targeted universalism, because the universal, even if it's right? It's like everyone wants the child to be healthy. But you still need to have people have the discussion, because if people lack agency, as someone else decided for me, I'm already feeling other. And I've talked to government officials, and they said, and literally when they said, we're trying to do the right thing and people won't listen to us. And I said, have you listened to them? WHO reached out to me about helping get the vaccine in the Black community. And I said, yes, I'll help. First question, have you talked to the Black community? Like, no. All right, that's where you start. So, so you really want to, and again, doesn't mean that you delegate your responsibility or authority, but it does mean you really create a space. I just gave a talk earlier today, my voice is a little raspy, to 300 governments across the country. And one of the things I said to them is that in terms of the polarization that's happening, it is not your job to actually solve it as much as is to create a container where people can come together and solve it themselves. People don't want the government telling them what to do. People want to have a voice. And so part of this is actually, and they may come up with exactly what you would have decided at the very beginning. But the fact that they participate in it makes it a very different process.
So as we take a look at targeted universalism and actually putting into practice, what are the philosophical commitments needed from a teacher, from the school and the district level? What are the philosophical agreements that there are commitments they're going to need to make?
Yeah, I mean, the first one is to really listen. I mean, part of it obviously just needs to be, depending on how widespread you do it, because you could do it just in, around curriculum, you could do it around student assignment, you could do it around whatever. But you could be very expansive. I mean, so when you say the community, are you considering business? Is business part of the community? And they say, this is what we need, and which might be different than what parents think they need, what educators, and part of it, I should just say, Chris, I mean, we do research all over the world, but we're not passive. So when someone says it's going to do something that we think is really not supported by the research, we let them know. So you may get to decide, but you asked us to inform you. And all the research says this is likely to work. All the research says this is likely not to work. And then if you're going to do something that's likely not to work, God bless you and good luck. We're not doing it with you. So I think part of it is creating a space to really listen, to have it curated. And it probably will take some resources. Ideally you would do it before the school year. I mean, I don't know, I haven't looked at it, but I think there were literally billions of dollars that the Biden administration was talking about as a result of COVID and helping the schools. There may be some resources to actually, give you an example. At the beginning of the pandemic, everyone told, all the professors at Berkeley said, you're taking a pay cut.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, that's fair. They tried to do it equitably. It's like if you're staff, you didn't take a pay cut. If you're a professor, you took a pay cut. I just got an email today saying, we're giving you a pay increase, right? And part of it is that federal money coming in. I think Berkeley did it pretty right in terms of, let's say, they're having people talk about, we're facing a short term, how do we do this equitably? How do we do it in a way where, so we could go universal, everyone gets a 2% pay cut.
Yes.
Or we could say, you know what, our staff is already not making that much. And they can't, and they're going to be hit the hardest in this pandemic. Let's see if we can hold them harmless, which means professors, you need to take a 5% pay cut, which is, and that's essentially what, but they took a couple of weeks for us to talk about it. And my point is that now money's coming in, and now there's going to be a scramble as to, okay, I don't know how much we're going to get, but how do we spend that money that's coming back into Berkeley? All the things that we postpone, and I'm concerned that students and a couple of students who said they couldn't come now without scholarships. So anyway, my point is that to have some process, a structured process to actually make that happen, so people feel like, again, I think people can put up with a lot if they feel like they've really been heard. They won't put up with anything if they feel like no one actually took them into consideration.
So that kind of comes to the next question we had is, we can imagine that you've worked with a lot of groups and communities and schools there where targeted universalism was attempted, but was widely unsuccessful. What were the hallmarks of it being unsuccessful?
Well, I don't know many that are wildly unsuccessful. There are a few. So I'll tell you one. Usually what happens when they're unsuccessful, it doesn't get off the ground. So there are two examples I give. One was a school system where the union felt like this was actually an effort to actually bash the teachers. We were asked to come in and help them do some things, and they had huge racial disparities. We were asked to look at those racial disparities by the superintendent, but the superintendent didn't get the buy-in of the union. And there's particularly head of the union was just like, no, this is, even sharing the data was considered inflammatory. You know, you're going to say, these are the two teachers who are expelling all the Black kids. You're trying to say those teachers are racist. And we tried to 50 different ways to say, we'll keep everything private, that we are not going to do this for this group. And it was a parent group and NAACP. And we said, why don't we restructure this so we're doing it for everybody? You know, that we're literally working for all of you. And we got very close, but it fell apart. And I think they ended up in a lawsuit. There have been other cases where people have come in. I'll give you two other examples. Other cases where people come in and assume that it really means just focusing on the most marginal population. And we were brought into another district, and again, it was looking at Black and Latino, and other groups had concerns. There were disabled groups. There were, and we tried to broaden it, and we eventually did, but it was hard because it felt like broadening it was diminishing the focus on race, and so those were two examples that that essentially didn't work. But from my perspective, they weren't really tried. Or first example never got off the ground because the trust level matters. And if people think you're, no matter what you say, if they think you're really trying to, cheat them,
Well,
it doesn't work. And there's another one I could give you, another school system which had created a program actually using our work, and they created for Black students, Black male students. And female students, Latino students felt like they didn't have a dog in the fight. And again, it wasn't a process. And I was saying, if you do it right, you're fixing the system. And if you fix the system, it should help all groups. And you need to make the case why you want to actually focus on Black boys. And I think you could make the case, but they hadn't made the case. They just announced it, and it didn't survive.
okay, I'll take some of the questions that we have here. How do you feel that targeted universalism is a better model or structure than what's currently being used in some school districts? Like, what do you see as the difference and how it's more beneficial?
Well, there's so many different school systems. So, so here's one thing. I think curriculum, is important, and there's very good data on that in terms of teaching students so that they show up in the curriculum in a positive way. There's very strong research showing that in places like New Mexico, Latino students started performing much better when they taught the history of Mexican Americans in Mexico. The legislature eventually challenged that. They said it was teaching hate. I'm sure you saw that. Former administration said you can't teach critical race theory, and the current administration said you can. To me, it's sort of a funny thing for government to say you can't. I mean, it's like, really? I've been teaching for 40 years, and very seldom has someone said you can't teach something. Anyway, so everything's become political in a way, and racialized. One of the things, this is complicated, but I'll name it anyway. The way people talk about equity, and it's breaking, it's polarizing. And some of it's legitimate, some of it's not. But for example, Robin DiAngelo's work, which I'm sure you're aware of, in terms of white fragility. I know her, I've used her works in the past, but I also think there's some really serious pitfalls. I'll be more concrete. I won't name who, but I work with one of the largest unions in the United States. They adopted a lot of this work, and then they were telling me they're having difficulty implementing it. And I said, so talk to me about it. And what they said is that they were having a hard time having their white members on board, even though they had a targeted universalism approach. And I said, so tell me more. And they said, well, we teach them about the history of enslavement of Black people and Jim Crow, and we try to get them to understand their white privilege, and about 30% of them aren't buying it. And I said, without knowing who these people are, you're a union. So you're working with people who are literally working class. They're not feeling a lot of white privilege. They're still struggling to pay bills. And so the idea that you bring them in the classroom to learn about somebody else's pain so they will give up something, that's not going to work. That's not what we're talking about. And actually I went back to staff and I said, we got to figure out some way that we can't just put this out there and then let people do it, because it goes off the rail too fast. And they thought they were doing exactly what we wanted them to do. Now that's not a school, but I think it's similar. So how do you actually have a curriculum, a practice that really does move everybody in the same direction? Then there's the flip side. There's a town in Wisconsin, I don't know if you saw this in the paper a couple of days ago, where they came over with a phrase, moving forward for all, or something like that. I have it on my phone, a community for all. And it's only one Black city council member there, but the rest of the white city council members, not rest of them, but a majority of them felt like that was an attack on Trump, and it was too divisive. And it's like, to me, that was sort of interesting, because the term doesn't suggest divisiveness at all to me, but it does suggest at least a need, and it's not that you can get everybody, right? There's some people who are just not going to go no matter what you do. But I would be interested in finding out what it is, what is it that's scary in that term for people? Why would people reject a statement? The name of this, they were saying like Detroit for all. You know, okay, so what's threatening about that? So apparently something is. So I know in terms of schools that's going to show up as well. So to answer your question more granular, I have to look at a specific school and what they're doing, because I think schools are carrying, there's a whole gradient in terms of what schools are doing.
Okay, thank you. We have about 7 questions left from our audience. Please address the relationship between housing and education. Must there be housing equity before we can expect education equity?
Great question. So there's a deep relationship, but the answer is no. So I mentioned Wake County, which is one of the, they had an amazing success in some of the stuff they did. And one of the things they did, I think I mentioned, is they said no school will have more than 40% of their students on free and reduced lunch, and no school should have more than 25% of their students who have failed the statewide exam. Wake County is Raleigh, North Carolina, large Black population. In order to achieve that, they had to bus students all over the place because they're residentially segregated. Ideally, they would not have been, but they are. And then people attacked the busing. And for a while, they actually rescinded the program because they're saying, kids are getting on a bus. Everybody's being bused all over the place. And yet, system-wide, it was one of the most successful systems in the country. Not perfect. It would have been better if they had integrated schools or not schools, but housing, which allowed students to actually walk to school, but they didn't. So there's a powerful link people have written about the relationship between housing and schools. And I think there's a powerful link. But sometimes you just have to take what you got, right? Anthropologists say humans are not maximizers. We are, as a species, we go for good enough, and maybe some of us go for less than good enough, and some of us go for more than good enough. But I would worry if we delayed work in schools until we fixed housing. I said, do them both. But if you can't do them both, do one of them at least.
Yeah. I do notice that Paul Goodard had posted the link in our chat for the article regarding Wisconsin. All right. So our next question is, how does one who is trying to implement targeted universalism deal with situations where a resource really is limited? For example, individual attention from a teacher during a class. Let's say the need for each student varies, but each student needs some.
Well, two things I would say. So I've worked, everybody's limited, right? Some more limited than the others, right? So targeted universalism is both an operational strategy, but it's also a communication strategy. It's how we talk to each other. And I think the message is that we care about everybody. That's the message that needs to be communicated. And we can't necessarily do everything for everybody at the same time, but neither do we want to be in a situation where we're asking a group to be a dream deferred. Like in the very distant future, we're going to fix your problem. In the very distant future, I'm going to be dead. And so what we have done in some cases is where there's scarce resources, it's got people to divide up the resources or something on a formula that reflects the fact that people are differently situated. So for example, you might say, if one group has 5 times the needs, they get 5 times the, and it's not really quite that way, because if you have 5 times the needs, you probably need 7 times the intervention. But you actually make it so that everyone sees themselves in the solution. And what we have found is that when you do that, not all the time, but oftentimes the resources increase. That people are more willing to actually put resources in if they think that they're going to benefit from it. But if I think another group is going to benefit from the resources, then it's like, I'm not supporting it. So there are hard questions. I would just say the resource question, I would struggle with that one, because too often that becomes justification for leaving some groups out.
Hopefully that answered the question for the person who asked that. The next one is, and I believe this will be shared with the entire group later, but they wanted to know if you could reshare the transformative agenda 5 step plan, and then set the universal goal, 2, look at how targeted group measures up to the goal, etc. So they were missing some of the steps.
No, sorry I should have said this at first, but I will make the entire PowerPoint available to you in PDF. So it'll all be there.
All right. And then what is the actual work from the perspective of the classroom, building, and district level?
Well, I think, so we did this, and unfortunately it's a little dated. But I like to look at success. So who has done a good job based on the indicators that we care about? And we're constantly learning. So it's not like we can just take something off a shelf, and we each have our own situation. But to really, there've been school districts that have really turned it around. There've been schools that have really turned it around. And some of them have used some of the principles I've talked about. So we did a few years ago, we did a report just looking at all the schools that we could find so we could actually see what's working. At the end of the day, we're outcome oriented. Are people graduating? Are people performing? Are people staying in school? Are people safe? So I think that, if you can, from my perspective, it's better to do it at a district level. But if you can't, like your question about housing, maybe you can do it at school level. And if you can't still, maybe you can do it at a classroom level. I think each time you shrink it down, on one hand, it seems more doable. It's actually harder. But if you're doing it at district level, you got to get the superintendent, you got to get all the principals, you got to get the administration, you got to get, and that may be very difficult. So I think, I don't know if, I think Rockford is, you got your district. So, so it means you have potentially greater capacity to do things. And it's not saying that everything should be quote unquote 100% centralized, but there should be some clear guidelines. So when I talked about the school system that was having a problem with expulsion and suspension, they came with a plan at the district level, but they left a lot of flexibility at the school level and even at the classroom level. And that actually worked relatively well, and it got a lot of the people to buy in. If you just had a very rigid rule, it might be useful on some level, but you'd get a lot of resentment. So I think that part of it just being creative and flexible, and then talking to people, again, who will be, as they say, on the front line.
Well, you answered the next question that was there. It says, can each school have their own goal for target universalism, or does the whole district need to be involved? So it sounds like it's a combination of both with the support of the superintendent.
Yes, I think in terms of, I like universal goals that are universal in the sense that it's a district. The way you get there will need to be targeted. But I don't think each school will have its own. I mean, you may have some subsections of stuff for sure, but the real differentiation should be in the targeting. And what we also found is that working with some school districts, the capacity to keep data, a lot of this is data driven. And if it's too small, it's hard to have the capacity to keep the good data, right? Even at a school district sometimes. So you want disaggregated data, and you want data in some cases that is where privacy is protected. So you need a big enough sample size so you can't say, oh yeah, that's Miss So-and-so's class, because that creates all kinds of problems.
Yes. All right. And another question, why are groups targeted as opposed to individuals?
Well, think about it. I mean, the 330 million people living in America, and we do have, in a family, in a community, what's bringing us to this issue today? What's bringing us to this issue today is persistent, long-term, institutional, structured tensions and along racial lines. I'm co-author of a piece. I'll just show it to you. This is, I don't know if you can see it, Plessy versus Ferguson just came out. Yesterday was the 125th anniversary of Plessy versus Ferguson. So racial disparities is not about individuals. It's actually about groups. And what the country is struggling around is actually group-based. And actually, I've written another article about that, saying that we actually, a lot of the work on addressing polarization in the United States is actually built off of Robert Putnam's work. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And I know Robert, and he's a good guy, smart. But the problem is that he's focusing on individuals. And what you would do at the individual level, which is not unimportant, but it's very different than what you would do at the group level. And so in terms of trying to deal with, frankly, racial equity or gender equity, it's not an individual problem. It's a group problem. And I'm not saying you don't do stuff at the individual level, but the fact that we don't have more women CEOs is not an individual problem. It's a group problem and a structural problem. And so, so I think in the piece I wrote is just saying that Putnam, as smart as he is, he missed the boat because most of the issues he's dealing with are group-based and not individual-based.
All right. obviously we're working with you here in the Rockford, Illinois area and surrounding districts beyond Rockford Public Schools. And within Rockford Public Schools, the school that I am assigned to, Lincoln Middle School, we'll be working with Mr. Powell to help us develop some goals so we can make sure that our students here are more successful. But Mr. Powell, with everyone that you could possibly partner with, why have you chosen to partner with districts and schools from our region? And of course, your previous question was why now when we look at Targeted Universalism. So why now?
Well, it's interesting. As I said, I gave a talk earlier today to 320 different governments across the country. And I mentioned you guys. You're one of the, so we're doing too much work and we're hiring people and whatever. But to me, the need is so great. And the fact that you reached out as a city. So it's not unusual for a school district to reach out. It's not unusual for an employer to reach out. It's not unusual for a government to reach out. What is unusual is for all of them to come together. And to me, that's really, really potentially powerful. And I hope other cities, so you to some extent will be an experiment, right? It's like, so like someone saying housing or education, I would be much more excited if someone says, we're going to work on these two things together, right? And so in a sense, we've learned some things, but it's also a learning journey. And I hope, we have a handful of cities, you're one of them, and we will at some point try to put you in conversation with each other. But the fact that you're doing this at these multiple levels, and what I look for oftentimes is gaps. So for example, we actually have been looking at the private sector. The private sector has largely been left out of this discussion, and we think that's a mistake. And we don't think we'll get the entire private sector, but we're trying to get 10 big, fairly big. Well, we got a bunch of tech companies because we're here in the Bay Area, and we don't want to be all tech. But the point is that it's not the 5 or 10 that we get, but they become a way of actually affecting the entire field. So we're hoping that as we learn stuff and hopefully have some success, that not only helps Rockford, but it helps the entire country.
Miss Butler.
Yes.
Yes, I put a question where it was more like a remark, but my name is Flossie Horde, and I work with the Rockford Public Schools Early Childhood Program, 0 to 3. And when I heard about the presentation, I definitely wanted to listen in today. And my question would be, I live on the west side of Rockford, where we have a lot of disparity with the educational factors you was talking about, but a lot of crime and a lot of high school students, predominantly African Americans that do not graduate from high school. What can we do as a community on the west side? And I know this means the city as a whole, but we've been affected on the west side more so than any other side of the city. What can we do as a community to step up to the plate and start helping ourselves?
So I thank you for the question, and it's really important. We're working with LA on, I forget what it's called, but it may be called 0 to 3 but it's just education, right? It's not housing, it's not employment, it's not criminal justice, it's just education, but they're working on early childhood for thousands of kids in LA. What I would want to do, frankly, and we're a little further along with them than we are with you, and it's a team of people involved in that. I want to compare notes, but I don't know enough about your situation to see what's possible. They have a pretty substantial grant to help them with this, and it's I think a 2-year project. And the group is SEED, and I've asked the head of SEED, well, the co-founder of SEED, to join on one of the next calls that's citywide. His name is Paul Hudson, and full disclosure, he's one co-founder, I'm the other co-founder, so I helped start this organization a number of years ago. But if we're going to drill down and really answer that question in a way that's useful, we need, frankly, a lot more information. But I think the beginning of it is what you've done, which is just to highlight it and say, we want to do something about this. And at the end of the day, they're probably, 4, 5, 6 things you can drill down on. They're not 100, so you have to decide which of those things there will be, at least from our perspective. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the things I'm influenced a lot by is something called systems thinking. And the idea is that we have complex adaptive systems. So housing affects schools, affects employment, affects crime, affects health, affects all these systems are involved. And I can tell you, I went to one school system and they had 138 initiatives because, again, they had been influenced in part by my work. And the superintendent was very proud. I said, taking your work, I've read it, and I said, you can't do 138 initiatives. It's not possible. And the faculty and the staff, I became their best friend because they were exhausted. And I said, what you got to do, you got to figure out, and you got to stage it. You got to figure out no more than 5, maybe 3. And what you can do in the systems approach is you don't pick something because it's the most critical. You pick it because it's the most relational. That is, if you affect A, it's going to affect 15 other things. And sometimes it's counterintuitive. So it's like, you go to an acupuncturist and you say, I have, a problem on my shoulder. And the acupuncturist says, take off your shoes. I said, no, it's not my feet, it's my shoulder. He said, yeah, but you have a meridian point in your foot that goes to your shoulder. So that's what we're looking for, is those acupuncture points. And obviously your involvement in that would be very important. So I think at a high level, we can say something about a lot of things, but I think to drill down, there probably needs to be a fairly short list.
Thank you for the question, Ms. Flossie, and thank you, Dr. Powell. We do want to recognize United Way as we talk about community partnerships and how everyone should be at the table. United Way is a part of this event that is occurring today, and so we do thank them for their participation and support. United Way is also a partner with Lincoln Middle School in making sure that we have Dr. Powell assisting us with achieving the goals of our students here as well. I will let Pam and Chris take it from here. We have answered all the questions that were submitted. You're on mute, Chris.
Again, we need a lot of grace doing this Zoom thing, correct? So again, from the regional office, we just want to thank Dr. Powell and Pam and Billy at NIU just to provide this opportunity for us to get together and to kind of explore this research. And thank you for the community's questions. And if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me at ccollins@roe4.org at any time just to reach out and make some connections. So anyway, take care. Thank you, Dr. Powell, and we hope you enjoy your afternoon.
Well, thank you, Chris. I have 2 quick questions, actually the same question away. It goes in part on the question that Ms. Hort asked. What is your relationship with the parent community on one hand and with the teachers union on the other?
Well, I can only speak for our particular building. I can't speak for the whole district, but I do know that I believe Dr. Jared and Dr. Vosberg are on the call to represent Rockford Public Schools. We have parent liaisons in our schools, and so we are working with them to work with the community and build those partnerships and find the needs of our families in the area. And then what was the second part of that question again?
The teachers union.
In our teachers union, I know I saw a previous representative from our union, that was Paul that was on here. I don't know if he's still on here, if he still has a role, perhaps he can address that. But I do believe that the district works closely with the union and, to develop, 1, to work on this, and then 2, just in general, to meet the needs of our families in the community.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We're wrapped up here today, and we wish you all the best and wish you nothing but success in your endeavors and in actually implementing targeted universalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.